Soha, is that you? So
Yes, sir.
you're from the Indonesian embassy?
No,
No,
sir.
sir, I'm not from Indonesian embassy. I'm from Bahria University.
Okay, okay. Sorry about that. First of all, thank you very much for the invitations. And before we start, allow me to share my PowerPoints to you all. And of course, it is a very great honor for me to share with you about the Indonesia of you, or even most have, let's say, are quite familiar with Indonesia and Indonesian politics. And now, allow me to share my PowerPoints. By the way, am I audible enough to you all?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, can you see my PowerPoints? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, you can.
Okay.
We can see them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have 1 hour for these presentations, and then later on, I think we can continue with a discussion, a question and answer. And again, I've been assigned to deliver presentations on Indonesia's foreign policy. And I think the history of Indonesia foreign policy is quite long because it was adopted in 1948. But allow me to share with you the basic, let's say, understanding of the Indonesian foreign policy, and especially the principle of free and independent. And that is in our language, in Bahasa, in our language, bebas and aktif, but it can be translated into English as a free and independent foreign policy principle. And before I start, my name is Professor Banyu. You can just call me Banyu. Yeah, this is, you can call me with Banyu, Professor Banyu. Okay. Now, and once again, thank you very much, not only to the Bahria University, but also to the Embassy of Republic of Indonesia in Islamabad for inviting me. Okay. Basically, the structure of my lecture, my presentations, can be divided into several parts. The first one, I would like to share with you with the historical background of Indonesia's foreign policy, and then Sukarno foreign policy. Sukarno is the first president of Indonesia, and he was one of the founding fathers of Indonesia. And then later on, I will move to the different interpretations of a free and active foreign policy, yeah, a free and independent and active foreign policy. And then the second, or let's say the next part, is about the new order era. That is the second president after the Sukarno. And then later on, I would like also to share with you about the Indonesia's foreign policy in Southeast Asia. And you know, probably you know, if you may aware of, ASEAN is Association of Southeast Asian Nation in Southeast Asia. So this is a regional grouping in Southeast Asia. And now this year, Indonesia is the chair of the ASEAN, and we are going to have our summit next month in the early September, from 5 to 7 of September. And then I would like to share something about this with you. And then later on, I would like also to share with you on the experience of the our, let's say, pandemic, COVID-19, and how Indonesia handle the pandemic in terms of the foreign policy. Okay. So the historical background. So the foreign policy of Indonesia, independent and active foreign policy, was adopted for the first time in September 1948, when our vice president on that time, Muhammad Hatta, gave a speech of, it is a very well-known speech that is rowing between two reefs. The title basically reflected on the situations of the geopolitics on that time. You know exactly that US and Russia were the two major superpowers on that time. So in that context, Indonesia is trying to become the country in the middle between US and Soviet Union on that time. It is also means that Indonesia is not trying to be, let's say, to be lean on, to US or to Soviet Union. So the speech of the rowing between two reefs was basically the foundation of the principle of free. We are free not to lean on, to take a side to US or to a USSR, but we are going to navigate Indonesia in the middle between Indonesia and Soviet Union, but we will be very active, involved in international relations. And you know, that time later on in 1955, President Sukarno, by this principle, has moved toward the non-aligned movement or the Asia-Africa Conference. And for your information, your country was also one of the very active participants on this non-aligned movement. So this is basically the history of the Indonesia foreign policy principle. The next one, so I think this is something that I've mentioned earlier. The principle was basically based on our unique cultural values, historical experiences, and also aspirations of the society and our strategic position in world politics. Simply because, externally speaking, there were two superpowers on that time, and internally we have a lot of diverse society. So we are going to look at the situations in the middle to try to become the bridge between US and the Soviet Union on that time. So the other point of the principle is that the main roots can also be found in our in our constitutions. That was 1945 constitutions when we declare our independence just on 17th of August. So we have just celebrated our 78th independence just a couple of days ago. Yeah. So based on that constitutions, Indonesia committed itself to abolish colonialism and also to create a world order based on independence, peace, and social justice. As you may also aware of, that during 1945, after the end of the Second World War, the world international relations has been divided into capitalism, Western Bloc, and also Eastern Bloc, represented by US and USSR. So we are going to try to create a better international relations by trying to create a non-bloc or to navigate between the two on the international relations on that time. Then, so it also means that with this basic principle, Indonesia was going to play no favorite between two opposed blocks. That is, and those were US and USSR, and follow its own path through the various international problems. So in that context, Indonesia will also be able to become an active agent entitled to decide its own standpoint by not once again lean on to the Western or to the Eastern bloc. during that time. So that was the basic, once again, the basic principle of Indonesia foreign policy. So how can we take a look the foreign policy of Indonesia on that time? So basically, on one hand, domestically, we are also trying to mitigate the ideological rivalry among the competing elites in Indonesia, especially between the secular nationalisms and religious nationalisms. As I mentioned earlier, Indonesia consists of a very diverse societies, ethnicities, and religions. Even though the majority of the Indonesian people are Muslim, but on that time, the founding fathers tried to reduce the possibility of conflict among the society. Yeah. So by looking at this, we are trying to go into the middle, not to Western bloc or to the Eastern bloc. So, however, this is the case. Also shows the dominations of the secular nationalists over the religious nationalists. So this is the situations in the context of domestic environment in Indonesia. The next one. So historically speaking, as I mentioned earlier, also it can be divided into several stages. During the first 5 years of Indonesia independence on that time, from 1948 to 1950, Indonesia faced the challenge of maintaining its national independence, and it means that we have to defend our freedom against the Dutch colonialism and seeking international recognition. So in that context, we try to adopt the free and active foreign policy by trying to accomplish the above goals, where is the combinations of the diplomacy and a struggle. So in that context, we, Indonesia, on that time, use or utilize two different instruments by using diplomacy, negotiation, persuasions, but also the armed struggle to stop the colonialization, especially from the Dutch on that time. So that is in 1948 to 1950. So in 1951 to 1958, Indonesia on that time, because the competitions between the Western and the Eastern Bloc were very, very intense, and some of the societies in Indonesia also applied the or pro to the communist one. So in 1951 to 1958, the implementation changed when a strong anti-communist cabinet dominated by Masyumi, that is the Islamic parties, and signed the Mutual Security Act with the US in 1952. So in that period, there was a very strong competition between Islamic community supported by the US, yeah, in 1952, vis-a-vis or against the Communist Bloc Society of Indonesia. So this is a very serious problems on Indonesia on that time, because we can say that Indonesia was divided into two blocks: the Western, and then represented by the Islamic society supported by the US, and then the communist society supported by the Soviet Union. So in that context, we had a very serious problem on the domestic politics. So in that context, because of the situation, the Islamic parties need to split and try to force to resign from the cabinet. So the situations in 1951, in 1958 was very terrible for Indonesia, because there was a very strong fight between a communist and non-communist represented by the Islamic societies. on that time. So on that period, we can say that that was the only occasion in independent Indonesia history when a cabinet fell over foreign policy issues, because there was a very strong competitions and even conflict between the nationalists, the Western bloc with the Eastern bloc. On the next period in 1963, the cabinet in Indonesia government on the time tried to establish a more balanced relationship with communist and non-communist states. So in that context, Indonesia started to establish diplomatic with USSR in 1954 and other several communist states. But we can also say that on that period, we were still struggling with the situations of the competitions between communist and non-communist society in or within Indonesia domestic politics. A year later, because we aware that if we are going to become a more modern country, we have to come up with the idea to be non-aligned. And a year later, in 1955, or 1954 and 1955, Indonesia, President Sukarno, tried to host the Asia-Africa Conference in Bandung. In this conference, Indonesia tried to play a very active role on the international stage, as well as having a regional balanced relations in world politics. So by having the Asia-Africa Conference, by inviting a lot of new country in Asia and Africa, we are trying not to lean on US or to USSR. So we are going to move on the non-aligned movement. So that was the, let's say, the historical icon of Indonesia and also the Asia-Africa Conference to become the third or the middle, the third world countries not to follow US or not to follow USSR or Soviet Union. So this will be a kind of trying to create a more healthy, balanced relations in international relations. So the success of Asia-Africa Conference, then we create new friends with a lot of countries in Asia-Africa, and especially to abolish colonializations. So in that context, on the next stages or the next stage of Indonesian foreign policy from 1959 to 1965, Indonesia radically changed because of the domestic situations in Indonesia. So in that context, in Indonesia, there were three major actors. That is Sukarno, the first president, the Communist Party, and the military. And the military is trying to mitigate the influence of the communists in Indonesia, and then to put the principle of free and independent principle of foreign policy to the track. So that is the situations when there was a kind of radicalization of foreign policy and coercive diplomacy that could serve Indonesia national interest. So in '65, there was a very, very serious problems on domestic politics. So, on that time, President Sukarno has been forced to step down as the let's say the success of the non-communist forces in Indonesia. And then in '65 up to now, the situations has been changed radically, and Indonesia moved not to lean on the Soviet Union or the Communist Party anymore, but now becoming more democratic country, as has been stated in our constitutions. So on that time, the President Sukarno used the important aspect in the radical foreign policy. First is try to use conventional diplomacy and diplomacy as an instrument of revolutions. Before he stepped down, President Sukarno, he proposed the idea of NEFOS, a new emerging forces in 1962, as an international united front to reject the power of neocolonialism and imperialism of the West in 1962. And we have the NEFOS game in 1962 in Indonesia. But 3 years later, he was unable to keep this kind of domestic situations, and then he was forced to step down from the power. So, but basically, the idea of NEFOS, a new emerging forces, was the example of the use of external behavior of Indonesia and posture for domestic integrative purposes by mobilizing internal and national spirit and the strength. On that time, President Sukarno has also a very radical foreign policy when Indonesia has a very serious confrontations with our neighbor Malaysia in 1963. So this kind of situations then have become the radical factors on why President Sukarno was forced to step down in 1966, 65, and 66. But before that, in 1965, Indonesia withdrew from the UN, from the United Nations, and proposed the conference of the new emerging forces to replace the UN system. And Indonesia put more aside to North Korea and People's Republic of China and supported the idea of Jakarta, Pyongyang, Beijing axis. So on that time, Indonesia was dominated by the communist forces or Communist Party. So domestically, the close relations with People's Republic of China has increased the Indonesia Communist Party power on that time. So this has created a lot of war situations, especially from the majority of the people of Indonesia, especially from the nationalists and the Islamic people, and then they got the very strong political and diplomatic support from the US on that time. So this is basically the historical icon of the President Sukarno free and independent foreign policy. In 1957, we have been acknowledged as the biggest archipelagic country in the world. And in 1955, we organized the Conference of Asia Africa, or the 10 principle Bandung Principle, the 10 principle of Bandung, and then non-aligned movement in 1961. We also established the Islamic Conference of Asia Africa in 1965 and the Conference of the New Emerging Forces in 1965. So this is the historical hallmarks of the first year, or at least the 20 years of Indonesia foreign policy from the independent day of Indonesia in 1945. Now we are going to go into the new era of Indonesia when after the step down of the President Sukarno. In 1967 to 1998, Indonesia was under President Suharto, and Indonesia's foreign policy was adjusted to the new circumstances of the domestic and external environment. The first major foreign policy initiative of the new order. This is what the era that we label the new order of Indonesia, was to fix Indonesia relationship with Malaysia, our neighbor, and then we propose what we call as a good neighborhood policy. And that was also the time for President Suharto to initiate the establishment of ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to create a more favorable regional environment in Southeast Asia. And then this effort has substantially changed or altered Indonesia's foreign policy and committing to a good, as I mentioned earlier, a good neighborhood policy. We try to create more peaceful situations for us to further develop our own country and society, together with the first 5 of ASEAN members, that is Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, and Philippines, in 1967, August the 8th, as the development of the first establishment of the ASEAN. So the establishment of ASEAN was basically the effort to create an environment conducive not only to Indonesia domestic political stability, but more importantly, for economic development by removing any possible sources of conflict and distraction, not only in Indonesia, but also in the region. So on that time, this is the first time for Southeast Asia to be able to create a very positive regional environment to be able to develop Southeast Asia. And from that year, ASEAN, as you may aware, has become one of the most important regional organizations in the world. Yeah, and Southeast Asia has become the economic engine of growth, not only for the Southeast Asia, but also for Indo-Pacific and to the world. So that was basically the change of Indonesia's foreign policy to create a good neighborhood policy among the nation states in the region that is in Southeast Asia. And then later on, because on that time, US and Japan were the bigger, let's say, the biggest country in terms of economy and politics, especially with the US. So Indonesia tried to restore its bilateral relations with US and especially economically with Japan. And starting from that point, Indonesia has implemented or started to implement what we call as diplomacy of development to attract foreign investment in managing the domestic economy through the creations of IGGI, that is International Governmental Group on Indonesia, to be able to invite a foreign investment for Indonesia to be able to further develop its nation state. So we can say that 1967 was the starting era of the modern Indonesia in terms of economy. Yeah, because we have just started open our, not only our window, but also our door for foreign investment to develop Indonesia after we experienced a very terrible domestic experience during 1945 to 1965 for 20 years of the trouble of situations in Indonesia or problems. So on that times, President Suharto paid a very special attention to the interests of regional cooperations in Southeast Asia. And as I mentioned earlier, the establishment of ASEAN on August 1967 in Bangkok, Thailand, can be categorized as a manifestation of the new foreign policy of Indonesia, which emphasize the importance of good neighborhood policy in the regions. And it will enable us in the regions to develop not only in terms of national development, but also regional development. And we try to stop the war, and on the other hand, to create a more peaceful regional situations in Southeast Asia. So then, since then, ASEAN, or Associations of Southeast Asian Nations, has become the cornerstone of Indonesia foreign policy, because we believe that without a very good regional environment, it will not be able for us to develop our nation state. So regional environment is very important, or the stable and prosperous regional environment is very important, for our common development. So what are the major functions of ASEAN for Indonesia? So basically, when we are talking about ASEAN has also been able to not only to further develop our economic level, to increase our economic level, but also politically speaking, ASEAN has become one of the most attractive regional organizations in the world. So in that context, ASEAN for Indonesia has been able to become a very important foreign policy tool to restore and to preserve Indonesia international and regional credibility. So foreign policy on that time was primarily seen as a means for channeling economic aid, investment, and opening up the markets for Indonesia export. So we can say that, as I mentioned earlier, 1967 was the starting point not only for Indonesia, but also for other Southeast Asian countries to become the engine growth of economy in the regions. Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Philippines. And then, politically speaking, in Bali in 1967, ASEAN tried also to create regional harmony. It was manifested by the signing of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, or TAC, in 1976, to renounce that the threat or the use of force in settling disputes. So we are not going to use the threat or the use of force, and that will become the last resort of our relations. But on the other hand, we are going to propose to use peaceful instruments, negotiations, diplomacy, in trying to settle whatever the disputes that we have among the members of the ASEAN. And that was one of the main strengths of ASEAN compared to any other regional groupings in the world in dealing with the superpower or the global politics on that time. So we always try to endorse the use or the implementations of diplomacy and negotiations as our main instruments in our foreign policy. So in that context, ASEAN has contributed a lot to the development of a more autonomous regional order in Southeast Asia. ASEAN has also served as an important international bargaining tool for the member countries, especially when it was used to attract, to invite foreign investment, especially from European countries, US, and Japan on that time. It has also helped to enhance Indonesia international status in the regions and beyond. ASEAN has also become an important security measure for bilateral cooperations among the members. So we have a very good relations with Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and any other member states of ASEAN in order to be able to create a very conducive regional environment for us to catch up with our national development. So that was the a main important goal of the establishment of ASEAN, not only for Indonesia, but also for the other member of ASEAN. So in that context, ASEAN was the product of our commitment to a good neighborhood policy and has contributed very influentially and directly to the development of national and regional stability and economic dynamism. So we can see that there were the existence of open conflict, of armed conflict in the regions is non-existent because of the use of the ASEAN for us to settle our dispute so far among the members. So on the other hand, Southeast Asia has become, as I mentioned earlier many times, has become the a new economic propeller for the global trade. And then I think I'm going to go into the last part of my lecture on the issue of the COVID-19 and how Indonesia effort to try to mitigate or to address the issue. I took the statement from our foreign minister, the current foreign minister, Mrs. Retno Marsudi. She said that in front of the UN headquarters that no country is able to overcome the pandemic COVID-19 alone. In these connections, we have to be able to use multilateralism in terms that in the sense that we need to collaborate. So we have no other options but to count on the World Health Organization to be a platform of cooperations among our countries. So the instruments of diplomacy, cooperation, and negotiations are the best platform for us to settle any problems, including to address the problems of COVID-19 pandemic in the last 3 years. And Indonesia on that time, for example, our foreign minister has outlined 5 priorities in our foreign policy. The first one is to build independence, again, independent and active foreign policy on national health, resilience, and security. So this is the most important priorities during the COVID-19 pandemic. The second one is to support economic recovery and green development and sustainable development. The third one is to strengthen the system of protections of Indonesian citizens all over the world, to contribute to the advancing various regional and world issues, including COVID-19 on that time, and to protect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Republic of Indonesia. But because I'm talking to you, I'm discussing to you about the COVID-19 pandemic, the first priority is very important. And this is something that Indonesia has done bilaterally and multilaterally on how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, there were a lot of varieties of our diplomacy during the COVID-19 pandemic. The first one is that we have to understand that COVID-19 is a multi-dimension of security issue. So we have to move from traditional to non-traditional issue, from conflict to the possibility of war to public health security. So health security food security, and a threat to economic recession is very important. So in that context, we have to be able to deal with all these important issues with a multilateral system. So I think this is the reasons why Indonesia is very active in the global politics, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, because we will not be able to stop the COVID-19 pandemic without a very strong cooperation among the nation. So it was the time for us, and I think this is always the time for us to be able to cooperate, to collaborate among the others in order to handle any issues that we have. So in that context, we are talking about multi-layers foreign policy, not only bilateral, but also with multilateral matters. So in that context, for example, in 2020, the Foreign Ministry of Indonesia said that we have to be able to create what we call as global health and foreign policy, and that is strengthening health system resilience through affordable healthcare for all, and creating a very conducive and strong health system resilience. We need a very good cooperation among the nation state. So I think this is the key word for Indonesia to engage not only in regional platform, but also in the global platform by looking at the common problems that we have. And the experience of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic has given us a very important lessons on the ability for us to collaborate or to cooperate among the nation state. Because without this, we will not be able to cope the issues alone. Yeah. So in order to be able to handle the issue, we need to go hand in hand by having collaborations and cooperations among the all member states of the world, including in the UN. So I think that is the all the materials that I can share with you. And the last point is I just would like to show you the picture of the President Sukarno with your former president, the first president, if I'm not mistaken, of Pakistan, or Prime Minister. And then in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, President Jokowi, the current president of Indonesia, has also visited Pakistan, and I think we have a very good and strong relations between India and Pakistan. So by showing you this picture, I would like to conclude my lecture, and thank you very much for your kind attention. And I would like invite you for a discussion, and I'm looking forward to having your comments and questions from all the participants. Thank you very much. The moderator.
Thank you, sir, for the lecture. If anyone have questions, they can ask now.
Hi, Assalamualaikum, sir. Firstly, thank you so much for
Father,
this.
you can ask the question.
Yes, thank you so much for this very informative lecture. So my question was that I read in the slides, and as you explained it very well, that your first point of the foreign policy objective states that building independence and resilience for people. So did the government force its citizens to get vaccinated, or did they have a choice in Indonesia?
Sorry. Can you repeat your question?
Yes. the government of Indonesia, did it force its citizens to get vaccinated, or did the people have a choice that whether they want to get the vaccine or not? Because your foreign policy objective states that they want independence and resilience for people. So I wanted to ask that because in Pakistan, the government did force its citizens to get vaccinated. We were all forced to get vaccinated.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Faiza. Well, basically, the government during the COVID-19 pandemic tried to socialize and to provide a strong awareness of the importance of the vaccine. Yeah. So by trying to provide a very good awareness to the people of the importance of the vaccines, then the people can get, can have the awareness and can get the vaccines by themselves. So we were trying not to use, let's say, force, or to push the society to get the vaccine, but we try to create what we call as the socializations of the importance of the vaccine. So even though I know that there was kind of a rejection from some of the people, but by using a lot of media, paper, TVs, social media, even by the government on how important the vaccines was for us to deal with the COVID-19, then the people can go to the vaccine center by themselves independently. So this was something that we have been trying for in the last 3 years, so that Indonesia can be quite successful in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Does anyone have a question? They can ask.
Everyone, are you quite familiar with Indonesia? In my university, I have one student from Pakistan. He is a fighter pilot from the Pakistan Air Force, and he is now under my thesis supervision. His name is Sakib Hassan from the Pakistan Air Force.
I want to ask a question how.
Sorry, Aros, can you speak a bit louder? Can you speak a bit louder, please?
How Indonesia is trying to balance between China and US in the current.
Okay. Well, Aros, that is a very good question. Yeah. How Indonesia balance China and the US? Well, basically because we have a independent and active foreign policy, we try to have this kind of relations with these two countries. Well, I can say that economically speaking, China is a very important trading partner, or even the biggest trading partner to Indonesia. You know that we have a lot of projects with China, and I think Pakistan has also a very good relations with China in terms of economy. I know that China helped you in the development of Gwadar Port, and also Pakistan Air Force use a lot of the aircraft, fighter aircraft from China. However, politically speaking and militarily speaking, Indonesia is quite close to US, because I can say that 90% of our weaponry system, our fighter aircraft, our tanks, our vessel, Navy vessel, are coming from the Western countries, especially from the US. So in that context, I can say that economically, we are very close to China, but politically and military speaking, we are also quite close to US. However, this is something that we are going I'm going to say that in that context, we are trying to create what we call as a healthy, balanced relations. Even though we are economically close to China, but it doesn't mean that China can interfere to our domestic problem. In the context of politics and military, even though we are also quite close to US, it doesn't necessarily mean that US can also interfere to our domestic to our domestic affairs. So this is the way we try to create what we call as a healthy, balanced relations between US and China. And I know quite well this is not quite an easy task. And I think to some extent this is also the situation in Pakistan. You have a very close economic relations with China, but military speaking, you also have a very close relations with US, especially when you are going to deal with, let's say, terrorism in your border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So I think on that sense, we have a very similar foreign policy implementations between Pakistan and Indonesia. So that is my response to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes, please.
The question is, what are the key principles that guide Indonesian foreign policy?
The key principle.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, the key principles of our foreign policy is independent and active. It means that we are not going to lean on someone so heavily. Yeah. So we have to balance the relationship. This is something that when I mentioned try to respond the questions from Aros Fatima on how to balance between our relations between China and US. So that is the independent. The active one, the second principle is the active one. We are trying to be involved in any bilateral and multilateral forum or platform. We have a very good bilateral relations, for example, with Pakistan, but we also have a very good bilateral relations with India, for example. In terms of multilateral forum, just for your information, President Jokowi is now in Africa to attend the meeting, the conference, the summit of BRICS. BRICS is the acronym of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. What does it mean? Well, many scholars argue that BRICS will become the next, let's say, the next bloc to balance US. Well, you can say that, but in our world today, the point is we will not only be able to lean on someone, but we have also to open all the options. We have to keep all the options open. And when we talk about active in BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, those countries, we can say that those countries are the major economic actors in the world. So in that context, we have to be able to very active, yeah, and independently in order to try to find a lot of room for us to maneuver. A room to maneuver means that we are going to be able to get any foreign investment from anywhere. But politically speaking, we will be very free and no one can interrupt or to interfere to our domestic problem. So once again, the two most important or key principles of Indonesian foreign policy is independent and the active principle. So that will be my response to your question, Soha.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, you're welcome.
Anyone else want to ask a question?
Hello, I want to ask a question.
Yes, please.
Sir, so my question is that US is trying to militarize the Pacific islands. I mean, countries such as the Philippines and the islands of Japan, and also the submarine deal under the AUKUS arrangement. So don't you think that such militarization in the Pacific can become a threat to the Indonesian security? Or how your foreign policy will respond to such?
Okay, thank you very much, Salma. This is another good questions, and I like this forum very much. Well, as you may aware, in our regions, Indo-Pacific, one of the most important element is that there was and there is a great power competitions, and great power competitions is between China and the US. And you are quite right when you said that US is trying to militarize and try to put their let's say their effort militarily in many parts of the regions in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific, and especially on AUKUS. Yes, these situations has created a kind of worry, a kind of concerns, not only for Indonesia but also for ASEAN. So your question is very timely, and this is basically that is Indonesia is going to do to try to navigate, to try to become the bridge between US and China. And the instrument for doing that is in 2019, and this year as Indonesia is going to move forward. ASEAN has initiated, has proposed the so-called ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, AOIP. So ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific is basically the document, and this is a very good political document that ASEAN Indonesia is going to implement in order to balance the relations between US and China. So in that context, ASEAN, and under the chairmanship of Indonesia, is trying to become the bridge between US and China. So everyone can join in the region, but we should be able to follow international based order. So in that context, ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific will become a kind of norms or for any countries in the world to follow and to behave. So the first one is that we are not going to use the threat or the use of force. Even though US try to have a military footprints in many countries, as you mentioned, but by implementing the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, or AOIP, we certainly hope that the situations in the world can be controlled under the ASEAN, because ASEAN is still in the driving seat, and we have to put also ASEAN as the central actor in the region in managing a healthy relationship between US and China. So ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific will become the diplomatic tool for us in the near future to bridge between US and China. Thank you, Salma.
Thank you.
Good question.
Anyone else? I think, sir, that's it. These are the questions they want to ask. Thank you for your lecture. That's from our side.
Okay, thank you very much, Soha.
Thank you, sir. Allah Hafiz.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you for
Okay,
everybody.
thank you very much. I hope that the lecture will be useful for you all. And take care and always in healthy situation. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Allah Hafiz. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Permissions to leave then.